Hello there! Welcome to the Saraway channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for a story tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. By all means, share this story with anybody who enjoys a good story, because it doesn't matter whether you're a Bigfoot liker or not. This is a story that everybody's going to enjoy. But before we do, go and get yourself a lovely warm cup of cocoa. So let's get started, shall we? Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I still vividly remember the day when my life changed exponentially. It was a day that would ultimately turn our lives upside down for an entire year or so, in ways I never envisaged possible. And after that day, our lives would be on a downhill wood. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I still vividly remember the day when my life changed exponentially. It was a day that would ultimately turn our lives upside down for a year or so, in ways I never envisaged possible. And after that day, it would seem that everything would be in a downward spin as things got out of control, as our world would be shaken up so badly that we would become like the persecuted beads in a baby's rattle. I was 10 years old at the time, a fun-loving little boy that took a great deal of pleasure in running around out of doors and exploring the woods, and of course, as a rite of passage, getting as filthy as possible. I could literally spend several hours at a time out of doors and lose all track of time, as so absorbed was I in the fanciful world that I lived in my head. I had quite the imagination on me, and sometimes I would pretend to be a fireman rescuing my sister from a burning building, or I would be a cowboy or an Indian chief, or even a pirate that was sailing the seven seas. My sister Gretchen was an incredible sport. She'd play along with my whimsical games, and was happy when the need arose to become a damsel in distress that needed to be rescued by my heroic hands. At the time, our family owned a wonderful golden retriever mix called Pipkin, along with 2 shaggy cats called Mustard and France. Those animals I loved devotedly, as extensions of our beloved family. They brought so much unconditional love into our home. There was nothing better on a cold winter's night but to share my bed with both cats, who very frequently would lie up curled together on my bed, taking full advantage of my body heat, while they in turn were like hot water bottles for me, that never ever became cold. Pipkin, our golden retriever mix, loved Aunt Louise over and above the rest of us in leaps and bounds, and I'm not exactly sure why this was the case. He would devotedly follow her around everywhere she went, but sometimes he could be enticed away rather artfully from my aunt, with the persuasion of a tennis ball, as he loved to catch and fetch anything you threw for him, and more often than not, he would always carry his favourite stuffed toy around in his mouth all over the cabin, and would drop the dog-eared toy at your feet if he wanted you to throw it for him. But I guess the golden retriever breed is known for being very good at fetching. I have no idea why Aunt Louise never married. I guess as kids you don't ask those awkwardly uncomfortable questions, as you nonchalantly, very innocently accept how your life rolls out for you, just like you take for granted the hot water coming out of the water faucet, as perfectly normal and natural. You never wonder to yourself where the water came from in the first place. Let's just say it was a long-standing joke with the family that Pipkin was the husband replacement for my Aunt Louise, because he would sleep devotedly on the other side of her queen-size bed, occupying exactly the same place your other half might occupy, if you were married, that is. He would always face the doorway, almost as if he was guarding Aunt Louise from any unwanted intruders, and even though he was a loving, affectionate dog, I am in no doubt he would have given his life up in a heartbeat to save my aunt, as such was his extreme devotion to her. My dad would teasingly warn Aunt Louise, in no uncertain terms, that if she were ever to meet an eligible bachelor at some stage, who she might bring back to the cabin to live with us, that he was resolutely certain that Pipkin would not take kindly to being thrown out of bed or being forced to lie at my aunt's feet, almost like a second-class citizen, so to speak. My aunt had raised a scathing brow at my father, and made a face. "Oh, don't be so ridiculous, Ivan.
What on earth are you talking about? You and I know very well that that would never happen. No one could possibly take Pipkin's place. He's terribly important in my life."
Whether that meant she was not interested in men, I do not know, but I never got to ask her about that, as at 10 years old I never considered it strange that Aunt Louise had never married, or that she lived with us. I do know that my Aunt Louise and my mother Angela could never ever live apart. They would have absolutely hated the idea. They were as thick as thieves and were like two slippers. One didn't fare too well without the other being around. I guess my father realized when he married my mother Angela that he was indirectly marrying Aunt Louise as well. My Aunt Louise was my mother's identical twin sister, and you really could not tell them apart, even if you tried to guess who was who. They used to tell me and my sister a plethora of hilarious stories about how they would change places at school, pretending to be each other, which really made me laugh, as they were able to lead people up the garden path, as no one could tell who was who. Let's just say when people saw them walking side by side down the streets of Anchorage, they would probably think they were seeing double. My father, of course, could always tell the difference between the two women, and one distinctive feature was my Aunt Louise had a scar on her right arm, which she had acquired as a girl, and although it had faded with time, it was still very discernible. If you look close enough, that is. The injury was caused from a rather unfortunate run-in with a very angry billy goat, which Aunt Louise encountered when taking a shortcut through a farmer's field, when walking the family dog. I think she was 15 years old at the time. The billy goat thought my aunt and her sausage dog Pegasus imposed a very formidable threat to the two female billy goats that he was obviously intent on impregnating with his virulent sperm. Woe betide if you got anywhere close to those female goats, you were in serious trouble, because this billy goat was not for sharing, and was willing to put up quite the fight if any competitors dared to cross his path, regardless of what they looked like. I think he thought my aunt was trying to challenge him. She had nonchalantly walked past the goats, not realizing the trouble that was brewing in her wake, as the male goat, with an angry enthusiasm of a bull charging at a matador's red flag, began to race towards Aunt Louise. My aunt had failed to see the warning signpost that the farmer had put up on the trail, which read, "Beware, angry billy goat." That was an understatement, to say the very least. Angry was not the word. This billy goat was incensed at the very sight of my aunt, wearing jeans and a T-shirt, and walking along with a sausage dog devotedly at her side. My aunt, of course, had tried to make a hasty escape when she realized she was being charged by this doggedly determined bucking billy goat that was pounding away at her with its horns, causing my aunt a plethora of bruises and scratches. Aunt Louise ran to the barbed wire fence and crawled under it as fast as she could with her dog at her side, who escaped, of course, without so much as a scrape. But alas, Aunt Louise didn't fare quite so well, as a piece of wire indiscriminately tore through her flesh, so deeply, in fact, that she acquired stitches on her arm. I gather the nurse who was stitching her up at the time said, "How the heck did you manage to do this to yourself? That's quite some cut you've got. You're also going to need a tetanus shot, I suspect. It looks nasty." My Aunt Louise had said, "If I told you what happened to me, you wouldn't believe me." It would seem after the injury had healed up, it had left behind a very discernible scar, which meant that you could always tell my Aunt Louise and my mother apart. And that was useful for those who were challenged in trying to determine who was who. There were, of course, other discernible differences with my Aunt Louise and my mother. My mother was much more uptight than Aunt Louise was. She'd get more anxious and take life a whole lot more seriously. Let's just say she was the world's worst worrier, whereas Aunt Louise never worried about a single thing. She was a risk-taker, took life in her stride, and had an adventurous spirit. I remember we went to a fairground once, and Aunt Louise didn't hesitate to take a ride on the roller coaster, but my mother simply couldn't do it. Just seeing it going round and around at such a speed made her really quite queasy. So yes, there were differences, but they were so subtle. I could never understand the conundrum of why my Aunt Louise and my mother,
would wear exactly the same clothes as each other, day in and day out, like they had done when they were children, as I know their mother, my grandmother, had loved to dress them the same. I could understand them doing this as children, but as adults I did think it was awfully strange. It rather surprised me that they didn't want to express their own individuality. The only differences in the clothing that they might wear might be that one of the twins might wear a different pattern or colour in the same style of dress. One woman might wear white cowboy boots, the other brown, in exactly the same style, but a different shade. My mother and her sister had dark brown hair done in exactly the same fashionable style that was neatly cropped on the shoulders, so it was clear they wanted to look exactly the same, which happens a lot with identical twins, which is something I can't exactly understand. For me personally, I like to be different. I wouldn't like to be told I looked identical to someone else. I've always prided myself in my individuality, but my mother and her sister seemed to like looking exactly the same. When I asked my father why this was the case, he just said, "Let them be, will you? Twins are complicated. For them, looking the same is expressing themselves. I know it's hard to understand, but it is the way it is." My sister Gretchen was almost 8 years old, so I was 2 years her senior. My father was a journalist working for a local paper in Anchorage. He worked at home a lot in his study, where he'd spend countless hours blasting away at his computer keyboards and spending a lot of time on the telephone or on emails discussing various projects with people. Failing that, he might be at the main office in Anchorage doing an investigation or sometimes working with other journalists. Sometimes his work might mean he was away from home for a while, visiting other states, and occasionally even going abroad. He was also a ghostwriter for people who wished to write their own autobiographies, but wouldn't know how to do so in the first place because they couldn't write. And he'd occasionally write articles for company magazines. When my father was away from home, we were left to our own devices, without the man of the house being around. My Aunt Louise was a teacher by profession, but instead of working at a local school, she harnessed her attention in homeschooling us, and gave us a formidable education. My father paid her handsomely for her trouble, although she'd have happily not accepted any wages at all. She was a brilliant teacher, who devoted her time to giving us individual attention. At the time I had no way of comparing my lifestyle to your average American kid. We lived in what I would describe as an idyllic setting, in a charming, postcard-perfect cabin in Alaska that looked like something out of a fairy tale, or something you might observe adorning a delicious box of Swiss chocolates. Let's just say, to the casual outside observer, they probably wouldn't have an inkling that the dreamy impression the cabin so obviously conveyed left no hint of how bleak things could ultimately become during the winter months, when temperatures invariably plummeted to well below zero. Winter was a powerful force to be reckoned with in Alaska, that could cruelly govern the snow-covered wilderness with blizzards and heavy windstorms that can make the cold weather very vicious indeed. So much so that being caught out in the snow could be deadly. Ostensibly on the inside, our cabin really was, in every sense of the word, sumptuously cosy and warmly welcoming. My mother and Aunt Louise had such a natural flair with decor, but they chose furnitures like sofas and chairs that were practically begging you to take a seat and lift up your legs after a long, hard day. Everything in that cabin was not only aesthetically pleasing to the eye, but built with only comfort in mind. When you entered the cabin, you were immediately greeted to a warm, welcoming atmosphere. We were lucky as our cabin was situated not too far away from Anchorage, and we would pick up supplies from Anchorage at least once a week when we did the big shop. Me and my sister Gretchen loved to go to Anchorage for a shopping day, as it was a day out for us. We'd enjoy a more suburban adventure that didn't involve trees or wild animals, but ice creams and candies. My parents would usually treat us to a yummy lunch at the diner, where we'd order burgers, French fries, and scrumptious double-thick chocolate milkshakes. If my mother was feeling extremely generous, that is, she'd take us to a toy store to buy ourselves something extremely special. I would return with a pirate's hat, or an Indian headdress, or some kind of slingshot perhaps, while my sister liked teddy bears and all kinds of fluffy animals, but never once did she show any interest in owning a doll, which was unusual for a girl of her age.
We would enjoy our weekly visit to the old-fashioned sweet shop that was run by a dear old lady called Mrs. Goldman, who was a buxom woman in her 40s, who always wore a blue and white apron around her ample midriff.
"Hello there, young man,"
she would say to me with a bright, cheery twinkle in her eye.
"What will it be for you today?"
She would grab a blue and white striped paper bag and would point to the large bottles of sweets on display, on the shelves, of which there were so many, too many to count, and she'd fill our bags up with sweets and give us a few extra as a gift. I always felt incredibly important when she devoted so much attention to me, as if buying sweets was a very important job. She'd give me a wink, and I would leave that sweet shop feeling like I'd just been to candy heaven. One morning in the middle of what I would describe as one of our bleakest, most miserable winters on record, where my sister Gretchen and I were regulated to staying indoors most of the time, it would seem going out in these perilous, rather treacherous conditions was tantamount to putting your bare feet into a bowl of ice-cold ice, until they became so numb you could no longer feel them at all. We would only embrace the outside elements when needs must, when we had to sweep away the snow that had gathered on the outside step, or sprinkle salt across the walkways to reduce the possibility of slipping. Every morning it was my job to collect firewood from the stash outside in the shed to bring indoors, that my father had assiduously prepared and chopped up meticulously over the summer months, especially for winter. And in that shed was a mountain of firewood that reached the ceiling, along with a whole heap of coal that we could get through incredibly quickly, as it took a whole lot of fuel to keep our cabin snug and warm all winter long. Me and my sister Gretchen were acquiescently expected to do our chores every single day. My father would always say it was good to get our hands dirty, as nobody ever got strong without learning to lift a heavy load. Even my 8-year-old sister was expected to pull her weight around the place. Ostensibly, when you grow up in Alaska, you simply can't afford to depend on others all the time. You need to learn to be self-sufficient. You never know when you might find yourself lost in the wilderness. Our father had taught us wilderness survival skills that go hand in hand with living in the wilderness. Me and my sister knew how to make a fire without matches and to build a shelter for ourselves. Our father had taught us how to hunt and fish. I was also responsible for helping my father chop firewood, and so at 10 years old, I was pretty strong for my age. Aunt Louise didn't care what the weather was like. She'd always insist on taking Pipkin for a 30-minute walk, well, almost, come rain, shine, or snow. The only exceptions to this steadfast rule of hers was when the weather was treacherously windy or hazardous blizzards were wreaking their chaotic havoc across the tundra, meaning that it would only be a fool who would dare to venture outdoors. When Aunt Louise returned from her walk, her nose was usually bright pink and her cheeks were flushed. She would instinctively run up to the log fire in our living room to warm her frosty hands, when finally she'd remove her gloves and say, "Ah, that is so much better." She'd shake her fingers that were as pink as her face and say, "I almost feel human again. Goodness gracious. I always forget how dreadfully cold it is out there. But Pipkin, he doesn't care what the weather is like. He seems invulnerable to it all." I would tell my Aunt Louise that I wasn't remotely surprised she was complaining about the cold. She always insisted on walking Pipkin twice a day, in less than congenial, sometimes perfidious weather, but nothing seemed to intimidate or daunt Aunt Louise, as like many Alaskan women such as herself, she was made of tough, very robust stuff, and she and my mother, although slender, were athletically very strong, with muscles in all the right places. Aunt Louise would tell us to get our books out. She taught us our lessons daily at the desk in the living room. Pipkin would flop down lackadaisically by her side, where Aunt Louise took her seat at the head of the table. He would drift into a deep, very contented sleep, very satisfied after spending some time out of doors with Aunt Louise, chasing after some very interesting scent trails, which he was lightly now dreaming about. We would work at the large walnut desk table, all the while listening to the sound of a crackling fire, accompanied by Beethoven's concerto playing in the background. My aunt emphatically believed that playing Beethoven would inspire our creativity and enhance our learning abilities. Whether she was right about this, I'm not entirely sure. But learning while listening to music was not a bad thing. It had been a laborious struggle, a battle, if you like, to get out of bed on that icy cold, tempestuous winter morning that I always remember so vividly well, when everything, later that morning, would go badly awry, in ways I would never have imagined possible. The temperatures had severely plummeted. My mother was strict about punctuality and about us getting up early every day. She believed we needed to be disciplined as you would be if you were attending a local school, where you were expected to arrive at a specific time. The lessons from teachers would also be regulated to a certain timetable. My mother emphatically believed our lives should always be very structured, with lessons and breaks regulated to set times, so that our lives slipped seamlessly into a regular routine. "Children need routine," she would tell Aunt Louise. "During the week, their lessons and breaks must be at set times. Imagine if they are older and they think it's all right to rock up at an interview half an hour late, because they never grew up knowing the importance of strict timekeeping and punctuality, because it's terribly rude to be late for things. If they're being homeschooled, they need to understand these disciplines. Otherwise, their interaction in the real world will be like a train smash." Every day during the week we were expected to be up and dressed and seated at the breakfast table by 7:30 sharp and no later. Woe betide you if you were late. My alarm had gone off earlier that morning, and it had been so hard to get out of bed because it was bitterly cold, much more so than usual. Our 2 cats were snuggled up to me so tightly, like great big balls of dense fur. I couldn't bear to be parted from the generous warmth that they supplied me with. I knew my mother would not be best pleased that I arrived in the kitchen for breakfast late. But this morning, I hasten to say, even my sister was facing a similar struggle to get up, and so we both attempted to get dressed in record time, understanding full well the trouble that awaited us. I entered the kitchen looking like I'd been run through a hedge backwards, with my sister straggling awkwardly behind me, like the badly dented tin cans on the end of a car when somebody's just got married. We both looked like sorry sights indeed, for very sore eyes. But that's what happens when you get dressed in a rush. "Where have you been?" my mother asked us when we finally entered the kitchen. "You're 10 minutes late. Your porridge is getting ice cold. Why are you not on time this morning?" "Oh, Mum, it's just so cold," I said. "It really is so cold. It was so hard to get up." "That's no excuse, Donovan. You know the rules. I like you to be up and about and rearing to go at 7:30 sharp. Is that too much to ask of you? And why is your hair in such a dreadful mess? It's flying all over the place. It looks like a bird's nest. Honestly, how can you turn up for breakfast looking like this? If you turned up for an interview like this, you'd never ever get the job. No one could take you seriously looking like this. They'd think you'd been dossing on the street corner. You look quite frightful." My sister began to chuckle as she found my mother's description of my hair, looking like a bird's nest, hilariously funny. "What on earth are you laughing at, Gretchen?" my mother said. "You think it's funny? You're amused, are you, that your brother's hair looks like a bird's nest? Well, you're no better. You should take a long, hard look at yourself in the mirror. You're wearing your sweater back to front and inside out. And as for your hair, goodness gracious me, don't you kids know what a comb looks like? The 2 of you look like you've just walked out of a tornado." "I'm so sorry, Mum, but it was so cold this morning. I was in a big rush to get dressed. I could go back to the bedroom if you like, brush my hair, put my sweater on the right way round if you like." "No, it's too late for that. It's not necessary," my mother scolded. "Your porridge is getting cold, but in the future I would appreciate it if the 2 of you took greater care of your appearance. It's very important to present yourself to the world looking respectable. Is that understood? You don't have a second chance to make a first impression. Always remember that." "Yes, Mum, I'm sorry," I said, suddenly feeling rather ashamed by the little attention I had paid to my appearance that morning. "Is this really necessary, Angela, to lay into the children like this?" asked Aunt Louise, coming to our immediate defence. almost at once.
"Don't be too hard on them, Angela," she said.
Aunt Louise gave me a reassuring wink.
"It's cold out there. The children are right about it. It's very hard to get up when the weather is so freezing like this. And it's dark outside as well, which doesn't help. Surely you can appreciate that."
My mother glared at Aunt Louise.
"Whose side are you on, sis? You know how I feel about discipline. It's very important that my children grow up with a regimented routine in their lives. If they were at school, it would be no different. I want them to experience the same regimes at home. Otherwise, they will grow up thinking it's all right to be late for everything, or to look like a bomb site when you arrive at an interview. They need boundaries in their lives, like we had as children. Our mother was very good with us like that, and I want to follow her fine example. It's very important, don't you see?"
My Aunt Louise wilfully ignored my mother's rather brusque remarks. She clandestinely winked at us and gingerly gestured for us to both take a seat at the breakfast nook, where she dished us up generous bowls of steaming hot porridge, served with warm milk and dark molasses like sugar. My mother had claimed it was freezing cold, but it was piping hot. This was followed by boiled eggs and toasted buttered brown bread. I always liked the weekends so much better, as not only were we allowed to sleep in, late, but breakfast was 1,000 times more delicious than anything we ate during the week. On Saturday mornings it was hash browns, bacon, sausage, fried eggs and toast, and on Sundays it was always pancakes with maple syrup, crispy bacon and eggs. But during the regular weekdays, breakfasts, I'm afraid, were characteristically always the same, rather dull, mediocre and nondescript. After breakfast we were expected to clean up the breakfast things. My sister would invariably help my mother wash up the dirty dishes in warm, soapy water, while I would leave the cabin, carrying a wicker basket to the shed, so that I would fill the basket up to the brim with firewood. And then I would return to the cabin. Sometimes, if there was a bracing wind out of doors, these simple, mundane activities could be quite the challenge, rather like diving into an ice-cold lake for a few seconds, and then getting out. I would carefully, very strategically, add firewood to the crate. Then I would take another trip outdoors to collect more wood and also coal. My mother would often dry old orange peels to throw onto the fire, which were amazing fire starters and would get the fire going very quickly. We would ultimately be doing our schoolwork in the living room. It was important that we would be toasty warm, because let's not kid, if you're too cold, you're never going to successfully concentrate. Once me and my sister had completed our chores, which seemed to go on forever, we would then prepare the long worn-out desk table in the living room for our lessons of the day. We would arrange papers, books and pencils on the table. The first lesson of the day was always math, without exception, and that was because me and my sister could not stand math, and Aunt Louise thought it was best to get the things we didn't enjoy out of the way first. Me and my sister were 2 years apart. We were at different levels in our education, so Aunt Louise would turn her undivided attention to our individual needs. The only drawback, of course, of being homeschooled is we didn't have many friends of our own age, which was something I always deeply regretted, as it would have been fun to hang around with other kids. Once the lesson was completed, when it was light enough outside, this would be the quintessential time when Aunt Louise would take Pipkin for his walk. And we would have our first break of the morning, where my mother would give us some hot chocolate and a couple of raisin bran cookies that she had baked herself, that were always so delicious. During our break, me and my sister would invariably settle down to play a game of snakes and ladders, or any other board game that tickled our fancy. We'd keep ourselves preoccupied, while we waited for Aunt Louise to return from her 20 to 30-minute walk with Pipkin to resume the second lesson of the day. My father would often look in on us during our break, and he would ask us how our lessons were going with Aunt Louise, and what we'd learnt in math. As you can imagine, given we hated math so much, we didn't have much to tell him. He would then glance at his watch and say, "Goodness gracious me, look at the time. I better get back to work. I've got so much I need to do." If I had a penny for every time my father said that in my young life, I would be a rich man indeed. We would watch our father retire back to his study to work on his articles. of which there were so many. My father could be working on several projects all at one time. So let me tell you, it's not only women that know how to juggle several things all at once. My father was a master at it. In truth, I'd never seen anyone work as doggedly hard as my dad. And when he was happily tucked away in his office, sometimes I even forgot he was there. But I do know this, that even though my dad was always preoccupied, always industriously busy, he loved his job. And I hoped when I got older, I'd be able to say the same about mine. After our math lesson with Aunt Louise that morning, me and my sister were taking our regular morning break. We were drinking our hot chocolate in mugs and dunking the raisin bran cookies into the warm drink so that they melted in our mouths. It was a habit my mother described as nasty and extremely vulgar, so we did this behind her back whenever she wasn't looking. I tentatively watched Aunt Louise on this freezing morning, prepared to take Pipkin out for his regular morning walk, into the heart of the formidable elements that knew no mercy. I had already braced the freezing cold weather earlier on in the morning, so I knew how vengefully cold and spiteful the weather was, as I had brought in baskets of coal and firewood, and the weather was so cold it had burnt right through me, and the wind had fiercely tugged at my clothes with a feisty enthusiasm. The world outside was covered in thick carpets of glistening snow. Trees had long since been immodestly stripped of their glorious, beautiful summer finery, and were now bedecked with layers of white frosting, while fir trees, the evergreen wonders of nature that grow abundantly around here, had their needled boughs heartlessly anointed with delicate crystals, made to look arrestingly beautiful. The weather was relentlessly unforgiving, and I knew that all too well from bitter experience. So my only thought in my head was what was wrong with Aunt Louise. Why on earth would she go out of doors in weather like this? But I knew there was no point in reasoning with her. Why would Aunt Louise listen to a 10-year-old boy such as myself? I need not have worried. My mother would persuade Aunt Louise that the weather, with its whipping wind and snow sweeping across the tundra in sheets, might not be a good idea to embrace this morning. But then again, one thing I'd always learnt about Aunt Louise over the years is that she was rather like an unbridled wild mare that wants to break out of the stables all the time. And when she's like that, wild horses cannot stop her from doing what she intends to do, even if what she is doing is very foolish indeed. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.